Yo, dear listeners and viewers, hello and welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for tuning into episode 201, which is going to be all about the first 8 weeks in my current bulking phase. That's why it's titled The Redemption Arc, Chapter 1, following up on the prelude, which I released a few weeks ago, if you haven't checked that out already. Before we get into the meat and potatoes of this episode, I have three special announcements. Number one, please bear with me. As you can tell, I have a congestion. I will do my best to be articulate today, but I will sound pretty nasal. Special announcement number two. I have recorded over 200 episodes of this podcast at this point, which is incredible. I don't care how long you've been listening or watching for. I just want to really thank you for being here, because if it wasn't for you, this podcast wouldn't exist. Special announcement number three, I have a new freebie for you, the Mask/Femme Physique Blueprint. In a nutshell, it includes 4 gym programs, 2 for a more masculine physique, and 2 for a more feminine physique. And all choices include 3 to 4 days of training per week. The programs also have demo videos and written instructions for each exercise. You'll also get evidence-based guidance on how to make each session, exercise, and individual set effective for muscle growth. You get guidelines to set your calories and macros, including adjustments for gender-affirming hormone therapy, and you're going to understand how to cut, bulk, track progress, and make adjustments when you hit a plateau. I made the blueprint with my typical client in mind, meaning someone who tends to struggle with all or nothing patterns. So the blueprint is likely going to resonate if you typically start strong but then fall off your plan after a few weeks. If you feel like you have to be perfect in order to make progress, if you tend to over-restrict and then you overeat as a result of that, and if you jump between plans without ever sticking to one for long enough to see results. If you want the blueprint, just sign up for my newsletter via the link in the show notes, and you will get your copy automatically to your inbox or to your spam folder within a few minutes. And I thought that this announcement would be perfect for today's episode, given that I'm going to delve into the last 8 weeks of bulking for me. I'm recording this on Sunday, May the 10th, and I want to discuss nutrition, training, and future changes that I am going to make. I'm going to start with nutrition because I think that what I'm going to talk about is going to be really interesting to delve into. First off, in terms of my behaviors, I've been really consistent with around 2,225 calories, 130 to 160 grams of protein per day, averaging about 150, and between 28 and 35 grams of fiber, averaging mainly 30 to 32 grams per day. These targets were set in place in addition to around 10,000 steps per day, with the aim to be in about 75 calories, in about a 75 calorie surplus, I'm going to rephrase that. I was aiming to be in a 75 calorie surplus or so above my estimated maintenance. As a result of this caloric intake, in the first 4 weeks, I gained about half a pound for the entire month. And that basically showed that my estimation of my maintenance calories was spot on, and I was about 75 calories above it. Now that changed a lot in the last 4 weeks. I kept the same calories, the same macros, the same steps, and the same training. Basically, everything that matters stayed the same. And yet, in the last 4 weeks, I gained 2.3 pounds. So instead of gaining 0.5, I gained 2.3, which is over 4 times as much. Lol. So if you do the math for the entirety of the last 8 weeks, so the number of weeks that I've been in a surplus for, the surplus on average turns out to be about 150 calories a day instead of 75. So basically twice what I intended. And this is because, based on the last 8 weeks of data, not just the first 4 weeks, but all 8 weeks, the average maintenance calories seem to be 2,050 instead of 2,150. And by the way, I use range targets for myself and for my clients. So I would normally assign a target like 1900 to 2000 calories, not an individual number. So whenever I refer to individual numbers, just assume that I'm talking about the daily average over a certain period of time, over whatever period of time I'm talking about. Anyway, I think that this is going to be really thought-provoking to discuss in depth for a number of reasons. First off, it shows how much more unpredictable weight gain in a surplus can be compared to weight loss in a deficit. Second, it shows that estimations are just this. They are estimations based on the data that you have at that moment in time. And you can be off, and that's okay. Like, maybe I was off by 100 calories in terms of estimating my maintenance calories. That's fine. The point isn't to be 100% exact to begin with. It's to be correct enough to start moving in the direction that you intend. And then the goal is to keep collecting data and making adjustments, which is exactly what I'm going to talk you through in today's episode. Now, you might be wondering why the change from the first 4 weeks where I gained 0.5 of a pound to the last 4 weeks where I seem to have gained 2.3. And that brings me to the third point that I want to make. This is a really good example of how some people's body weights or body weight trends are more unpredictable than others. Not just on a daily basis where most people will lose or gain some weight, but also more long term when you're looking at the trend over weeks and even months. My body weight personally is actually really sensitive to the following factors. First of all, how constipated I am. I can easily gain 1 to 2 pounds overnight just from not evacuating enough. And if I'm more constipated than usual over a longer period of time, that can result in a weekly gain, even if I'm not necessarily in that large of a surplus. This was very apparent between 2022 and 2023 when, as you probably know, if you've listened to one of my personal updates before, during this time I suffered from chronic constipation. And it was chronic, therefore it was pretty intense for months at a time. And so I would gain weight in ways that I didn't expect relative to the calories I was eating, just because I was really constipated. And these last 4 weeks in particular, I no longer suffer from chronic constipation to that extent, but I still am prone to constipation. And in the last 4 weeks, for 2 weeks out of the 4, I was more constipated than I've been in a really long time because unfortunately there was a nationwide shortage of my usual constipation medication. Fortunately, it came back 2 weeks ago or so, and now I'm back to my typical standards. But over those 2 weeks, my weight fluctuated, and it was on some days even higher than it's been just in the last week, and then it came back down. And then the second factor that influences my weight is how much fiber I eat. Ever since developing that chronic constipation, my digestion gets pretty crappy if I eat more than 35 grams per day of fiber. I get more bloated, food sits more heavily in my stomach, like I can feel that my stomach is bigger because there is more food than usual inside of it. And I get more constipated because once the food has been digested and absorbed, I have more gut residue that's not coming out, and so it's accumulating in my gut. And this can add easily 1 to 2 extra pounds to my weight on a daily basis, which is obviously going to affect my weight on a weekly basis. The third factor that's affected me this month is illness. It is quite common for most people to see weight spike up because of inflammation when you're sick. And this happens to me as well. And 4 weeks ago, I developed this congestion that you can hear in my voice now. And I was actually pretty sick 3 weeks ago, where I developed more intense symptoms. Right now, I'm pretty much back to normal. The only thing that's hanging around is the stuffy nose. And fortunately, I got in touch with my doctor because I was like, it's not normal for me to have congestion for 4 weeks. And I asked him, is there anything we can do? And he gave me a prescription that hopefully, in his view, will make the congestion finally go away, which I am very grateful for because, oh my gosh, am I looking forward to being able to finally breathe again for the first time in a month. It feels like forever because I don't normally get this congested for this long. Anyway, as I was saying, 3 weeks ago was when I got the worst of the symptoms. I had a pounding headache, a stuffy nose, really stuffy, more so than now, and a really bad sore throat. So what's left now is mainly the congestion, as I said. And I decided to train through it at the time, even when 3 weeks ago it was worse than now, because these were all symptoms that affected me above the neck. And typically when that happens, if I feel good enough to train, I will. And admittedly, I was more fatigued, which is more of a systemic symptom because it affects you below the neck. But mainly the fatigue came from the fact that I couldn't sleep well because I wasn't breathing properly. So when I was actually in the gym, it wasn't that big of a deal. So anyway, I bring up these three factors to explain that the worse than usual constipation and the persisting illness could be playing a role in this large than expected weight increase. Another factor to consider is my thyroid hormones. When you change your thyroid meds and they change your metabolism as a result, in my case, they sped up my metabolism back to what should be my normal because I suffer from hypothyroidism, which means that my thyroid doesn't work well enough on its own without additional exogenous hormones. So my metabolic rate without medication would be suppressed, and therefore I would be slower. Anyway, when you first change your dose, and when I say first, this can last for months. Um, some effects are transient, and these are the effects that could last for just a few weeks or maybe a few months as you adjust your dosages. And some effects are more permanent. So it's possible that 8 weeks ago, my maintenance calories were higher than they are now, just as a transient effect of the fact that I was still increasing my thyroid hormones gradually at that point with the help of my endocrinologist. And then in the last 8 weeks, I've always been on the exact same dose, whereas I started seeing this private endo over 7, 8 months ago at this point, and I spent 6 months with her titrating my dose gradually up. So this is when major changes were happening to my metabolism, and as I've said, some were transient and some weren't. So this is an additional theory that I have as to why this big increase in weight might have happened. So anyway, the bottom line is I won't know for sure until I'm finally over this congestion. And luckily, my bowel movements are basically back to normal, so the constipation is less of a concern to me. And therefore, I need a little bit more data to be more confident. But what's really interesting about this is my emotional response to what's happened. So this week, I was thinking about whether to change my calorie targets. And I tend to make these decisions every 2 to 4 weeks in a surplus because it takes longer to interpret the data when you're trying to gain muscle in a surplus versus when you're trying to lose fat, because muscle growth is lower than fat loss. So at the 8 week mark, I was reflecting on the data, and I realized that I developed an emotional attachment to the idea of my maintenance calories being around 2,150. Whereas the latest data, the objective data, shows that, as I've said, I've gained at a faster rate than expected, and my actual maintenance based on these numbers seems to be around 2,050. But when I did the math and I had that realization, I noticed that I wasn't really keen on changing my calorie target because I quite like to eat. And so the higher the calories can be, the better for me personally as my preference. And so I was coming up with some reasons to maintain the same surplus. I was telling myself, well, there are these factors potentially affecting the weight on the scale. So you could just keep the exact same calories, change nothing, and see how things play out. But then I gave myself a stern talking to because I am self-coached. Nobody else is going to care about my long-term goals other than myself for now until I hire a coach. And my long-term goal is not to eat as much as I possibly can. My current long-term goal is to gain muscle in a surplus for as long as possible before I decide to cut. Because based on the evidence that I'm aware of and my coaching experience, it is pretty clear to me that spending longer in a smaller surplus is superior to spending less time in a bigger surplus. So yes, it's true that my current body weight increase in the last 4 weeks could be somewhat inflated by factors that have nothing to do with being in a surplus, but it's also been a whole month of the trend being faster. So at least some of this weight gain has likely come from a combination of fat and muscle from being in a surplus. Whether that's like the exact surplus I wanted, or whether that's twice the surplus that I intended, I can't be 100% sure yet, but based on the math, it seems to be the latter. Seems to be that I'm in twice the surplus that I wanted to be in. And I don't want to wait any longer to make changes and continue gaining at this pace, because it is going to end up cutting my surplus phase short, which is counter to what I believe to be a better approach. So I was feeling the psychological pull towards basing my decision on the ideal data, meaning I was thinking I'm going to keep everything the same because ideally the weight gain is actually slower, maybe my calories are still on point, and this weight gain will sort itself out when I'm over the congestion and over the constipation. But then I had to reflect on the fact that the constipation is no longer an issue. I'm back to my usual bowel movements, so that's no longer a factor, and yet the rate of weight gain hasn't really changed this past week. I'm also basically over the congestion. I only have a bit of a stuffy nose, so how much inflammation could I possibly be fighting? So ultimately, I am probably in a bigger surplus than I intended originally. It might not be exactly twice as much, but it's probably bigger. And ultimately, the data that I do have, not the ideal data that I might or might not have in the future, shows to me that based on the numbers, I am in twice the surplus that I wanted to be in. So I am going to base my self-coaching decision on the data that I do have, not on the data that I would like to have because I like to eat more calories. After all, if it turns out that I am being too conservative in changing my calories, I can always increase them again. At worst, I will have gained at a slower pace, or maybe I'll just have been at maintenance for 2 to 4 weeks, which is really not the end of the world. It just means that I can gain for longer, basically, and I don't have to enter a fat loss phase for longer than that. So my revised surplus target based on the data is going to be 2,125 calories, because if my maintenance estimated based on the last 8 weeks is around 2050, and I want to be in a 75 calorie surplus, then I need to be at 2,125 calories instead of 2,225 calories. So that covers nutrition and the change in body weight so far. Next up, I'm going to pivot towards training. While training is the priority in a surplus phase, I mainly only have good news, really. So I wanted to start with the maybe more controversial news around nutrition. But I wanted to say this now because I don't want anyone to think that I think that nutrition is more important than training. There was just more to say. Whereas training has been going swimmingly, to be honest. 10 out of 10, no notes from me. But of course, I am going to give you some more notes. So first off, I am really enjoying the new training phase. I love it. I am loving training legs every day instead of having dedicated leg days. Because if I'm training legs every day, I am doing overall less volume per session than when I have dedicated legs only sessions. And I find it that I find that for me, it's much easier to push myself to my target proximity to failure on each individual set because there are fewer total sets to do. So if I have dedicated leg days, I might start strong with the first 2 or 3 exercises, and then I lag. My energy lags by the last 2 or 3. So as a result of that, the last 2 or 3 might not be as hard or intense as I can make them if I have 2 or 3 leg exercises every single day. So I am loving that, and it's enabled me to increase my volume on both my quads and my hamstrings in a way that I think is going to be really productive. Because based on the evidence that you might also be aware of if you've listened to enough of my episodes, especially the interviews with experts where we talk about the research on volume and hypertrophy, but basically based on my understanding, the more sets you can do while recovering and seeing progressive overload, the better. And I really want to bring up my quads. And so it's been really enjoyable for me to be able to add more volume within my time constraints, seeing that I'm recovering well and seeing progressive overload, and that perceiving that I can push myself more. It's been really motivating. It's also made training more interesting because I can combine upper and lower body in the same session, which I personally find really fun. And I've also distributed my volume for the upper body differently. So instead of combining back and chest in the same workout, I'm doing chest and quads and back and hamstrings. And I find that it's enjoyable to me. I don't know that I recover better because honestly, I recover pretty easily from my upper body training, but it is certainly fun and interesting for me because I had been used for a long time to combining upper body and lower body in separate training sessions. So anyway, from a progressive overload perspective, progressive overload is occurring on most lifts at the moment. I tend to add maybe a rep or so most weeks, and that way I work my way towards the top of my programmed rep range. When I start a phase, I try to start towards the bottom of the rep range if I manage to select the weight properly. And then over time, I work my way up by adding more reps. And when I hit the top of my programmed rep range, that's when I tend to increase weights, which then brings my rep range, well, my reps back down. And I basically start the cycle again from the bottom of the rep range towards the top. I'm going to give you an example to showcase how progressive overload has occurred. So the first exercise that I do in session 1 is the leg extension. And I started with 52 kilograms for 11 reps at RPE 9 in week 1. And last week, which was week 8, I did 54.3 kilograms. So I added 2.3 kilograms over 8 weeks. And I'm now doing 14 reps. So I started 2.3 kilograms lighter for 11 reps. And now I'm doing 14 reps, so 3 extra reps at 54.3 kilograms. So an extra 2.3 kilograms, or about 5 pounds, I think, at the same exact RP of 9. And this rate of progression is relatively similar across the board for me. And I say relatively because it depends on the exercise. Isolation lifts can be easier to add reps to as opposed to compound lifts. But it also depends on the muscle. Anyway, without getting overly complicated, if I make apples to apples comparisons, then relatively speaking, this is the same rate of progression across the board, with the only exception being brand new exercises where progression typically happens a bit faster in the initial weeks because of neuromuscular adaptations, which I've talked about in other podcasts. Now, speaking of new exercises, I've recently increased my volume on the hamstrings compared to the start of the program, where in week 1 I was working up to 14 sets. And then by week 2, I was doing 14 sets. And then in the last few weeks, I've actually increased the volume to 18 sets. In addition to that, I also introduced forearm and rear delt training for the first time. I have never directly trained my forearms, ever. And I haven't trained my rear delts directly in years. So here's my rationale for these changes. In between January and February, I saw a physiotherapist for a few weeks to resolve some pain that I was experiencing in the right side of my back. And as he was assessing me, he identified my right wrist as a weak link in the chain that goes from my hand to my shoulder. So I decided to start training my forearms to ensure that they can keep up with my increasing strength, which will likely reduce injury risk. And hopefully my right wrist gets stronger as a result as well. And in addition to that, I just want to see if I can get bigger forearms with the volume that I'm willing to do for this muscle within my time constraints. I then decided to start training my rear delts, again inspired by this physiotherapist, because he gave me some rehab exercises to resolve the pain, specifically for the rear delts. So this made me think, why not continue with the rear delt training, even though I'm no longer in pain right now, which I'm very grateful for. And so I thought, why not continue with the rear delt training and then see if I can also get more jacked rear delts in the process. And again, this is all occurring within my personal time constraints, so it's not been a problem to add the extra volume. Finally, I've not needed to deload yet after 8 weeks of training. I may deload around my birthday week in mid-June. My birthday is June 14th, mainly because I'll be traveling for a couple of days. I'm going on annual leave or vacation from work if you're in America. So I might choose, just for the sake of making my life easier not to train while I'm traveling, and so I might deload. But this is the only time really when I plan deloads for myself or my clients in advance. If either of us is going to go on holiday or away, and we decide that the goal is going to be to take a break from training instead of trying to implement training while away. Other than that, I don't really plan deloads for anyone. I take a reactive approach, meaning that week to week I reflect with myself or with my clients on how training is going. And if I or a client needs a deload, then we'll schedule it for the following week, as opposed to try to plan it far in advance, because I think it just can break up your momentum. Like, if you don't need a deload, why are you taking one? You're just throwing yourself off of your groove of progressive overload for no reason. And if you do need a deload before you've scheduled it or after you've scheduled it, why are you taking it at the time that you're scheduling it, just for the sake of sticking to the original plan? So personally, I haven't felt a need to deload so far, and I might deload for my birthday, but I might not, because at the end of the day, I'm only going to be away for 4 days and I'm on annual leave. So I don't have work related constraints. I could easily train around that. But I'll see how I feel once I get there, because at that point, it will also have been about 12 weeks of continuous training without deloading. So I'll play it by ear depending on my recovery at that time. So that's a wrap for training and for the episode as a whole. In summary, I'm gaining weight, but perhaps a little faster than I intended. Training is going well, and the plan is to continue to stay in a surplus for the foreseeable future. Now, if you want to see the visual change from week 1 to week 8, I'm going to share some physique comparisons to my Instagram account on Friday, the 15th of May, which is also when the podcast comes out. So for you, it's today. So if you want to take a look, check out my Instagram account. They should be up there right now. Any questions or comments, let me know. Reach out. I've had some clients reach out to me off the back of the the prelude of the Redemption Arc series, so this series, asking some clarifying questions about my approach to myself. I've had some conversations with listeners that are not necessarily my clients. As you can tell, well, if you can tell, I'm about to tell you, I am really friendly and I welcome any comments or questions. And if you want to work with me, I am currently taking on new online clients. So you can read more about my services and prices, and you can fill out the application form via the link in the description notes to this episode. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I will talk to you very soon.